Welcome to OK Miniatures. Today we're going to be making dungeon tiles. Dungeon tiles are a great all-around item that you can have. They're great for making stone walkways, dungeon floors, rooms, pretty much anything stone that you can think of, they're good for. They're a great place to start if you're just getting into terrain building. They're super simple to make, so let's get into it. To start out with, I cut 3-inch squares on my hot wire cutter. You can use a knife to do this, use a square, but I have found that a hot wire cutter gives better squares, more squares, and cleaner cuts. I've made a video on how to you can make your own hot wire cutter if you're interested in doing that instead of buying a pre-made one. With that said, if you don't have one, you can definitely use your knife. Once the squares were cut, I adjusted the guide so that I would be 1 inch from the wire, and then I took each square and just put a slight line in it. This gives it a nice grid, which lends itself to a stone sort of texture like tiling. But if you don't have a hot wire cutter, again, you can just use a knife to cut that line and then make it deeper with a pen or pencil. I did carry these lines down the edges of the stone or the tiles as well. This makes it look like more three-dimensional if the edge isn't covered. When extending the lines down from the edges of from the top to the sides, you might not want to use the 1-inch guide because the wire can be wavy, so when you're holding it vertical, it might actually be at a slight angle, so it's not perfectly 1 inch. So if you just use the guide, it might not line up quite well with the top pieces. So it's easy enough just to visually line it up and put the mark in there. I also ended up making some smaller tiles, a 2x2, a few 2x1s, 1x1s. These will come in handy for representing doorways. If that way you don't need to actually put a physical door on walls, but you can just kind of show it with a little bit of a walkway. Once the tiles were all cut and ready to go, I used a rock to add some texture. It's actually a geode, but anyway, any rock you got is good. I find the rock gives better texture than wall tinfoil. This foam's a little bit stiff, so it doesn't take the texture from tinfoil quite as well as a rock, which you can put a lot more force on. I also added a few chips and cracks to some of the stone. I didn't go overboard with this since I want these to be fairly versatile and not just a old dungeon look, so more of a new-ish, well cared for stone, but not pristine. Then I went on to add magnets. Magnets can be a little bit expensive if you're adding them to all your tiles, so if you don't want to do that, feel free to skip them. Tiles will still work very well and still look great. But I'm an engineer, magnets are awesome, I can't resist. To make sure that these tiles remain completely modular and they can go in any position, I put 2 magnets on each side of the tiles. On each side, the left is going to be one polarity and the right's going to be the other. It doesn't matter which is which as long as they always stay the same. This way, if you rotate it, it'll always have the same matching and they'll always be able to match each other. To help me place the magnets consistently and quickly, I made a little jig. So, the side I wanted the magnets placed a 1/2 inch in from either side and then in the middle of the 1/2 inch blocks, so about 1/4 inch from the bottom. So I measured out those dimensions, 1/2 inch over and then 2.5 inches over, so it'd be a 1/2 inch from the 3-inch side's far side. And then I can just stick a tile in here. So I used 2 little nails. I actually ended up adding this other piece of cardboard so that the nails aren't sticking out super far so they aren't wobbly. I was going to hot glue them in place, but I found out that they actually stay quite nicely on their own, so I skipped that. They aren't perfect in the perfect spot. If you want a better quality jig, you can 3D print one. I believe Matt from RP Archive, he's got a jig somewhere. I will try to stick a link in the description if I can find it. And that way it's a spot on measurements. It's about right. So this is good if you don't have access to a 3D printer or don't have the time to do it just yet. It gets you by, gets you going. It's better than eyeballing, at least. For the magnets, I found it worked best to use, I have 2 hot glue guns. One's got a much smaller tip, but it doesn't have a trigger to advance the glue stick. So I use this to make little holes for the magnets. Magnets I used are 3mm by 2mm. Found it easiest to do one side at a time. I used a ruler to put all the magnets on one polarity, and then I put a dab of hot glue in the hole that I melted with the other hot glue gun and held the ruler against it with the one magnet lined up with that hole, let the glue harden, and then peeled the ruler off. This didn't work out perfectly every time. Originally I had a few issues with the magnets pulling out, so I went back and added a thin layer of hot glue over the surface of the magnet to give it a little bit more strength so it won't pull out. I also found that sliding the tiles apart instead of pulling them straight apart helps quite a bit with less magnets coming out, since it's putting less force against the glue. But if they do come out, it's easy enough just to reheat the hot glue, maybe add a little bit more and stick them back in there. I also had a few issues with some of the magnets weren't quite the right polarity. Just be aware that's pretty easy to mess up and it's easy enough to fix. Just flip it around and stick it back in. I didn't end up adding any magnets to the little pieces. I don't intend to need these in a large section, so I don't really need them to be magnetic, and this way they can line up different ways. They don't have to be right at a magnet connection. Once the magnets were done, it's time to go on to painting. Follow the pretty typical steps of painting, starting with a coat of Mod Podge mixed with black paint. That didn't give full coverage, so I went on and added another coat of black paint, just straight black paint, which made that much more opaque. For dry brushing, I started with brown and I worked my way towards gray. The brown gives it a little bit more of a stone texture or color. Stone isn't pure gray, so having a little bit of brown in there makes it look more realistic, and I think it looks a lot better this way. But feel free to use any stone painting techniques that you want to do for these. After the paint was all done, I gave it a nice little black wash, and it was good to go. If you found this video helpful, please hit the thumbs up, consider subscribing if you'd like to see more content like this. And with that, I'll see you in the future.